And once again, a very warm welcome to all of our attendees. So the last Toolbox talk for this month, coming up for change of scope today. Now, as we mentioned, what is the scope or scope of authority? It was generally a term used in agency law, in this case, occupational law, to determine whether a principal or the person who is most liable for the acts of his or her agent. In this case, we're going to determine that between the principal being the employer and their agent being the employee. And this is generally the conduct that we perform. So the scope of authority, or your scope of work, if we can call it that, aside from what we discuss in construction regulation, is what is customarily connected with or reasonably necessary for the performance or authorized act within somebody's authority. So in layman's terms, it's what you have to do for work that you are responsible or liable to do. So an employer hires you to do a specific task. As an employee, specifically being a plumber, you are hired to do plumbing in an industry. And so you will go out, you will perform your job function or your scope of authority. And that means you cannot sign off certain installations if you're not qualified to do it. You see, because your scope of authority has a limit. Now, each one of us has a specific scope, and that scope is limited by, it could be our training, it could be the competency of a person, it could even be the physical capability of a person. So perhaps you don't feel comfortable working at heights, and so you say you don't want to work at heights. Psychologically, it's not something that you would like to perform, and so physically you are not capable of performing that task, and so your scope will then be capped at working on the ground. And really, this is what we want to discuss with you today. And the reason why we want to discuss this with you is, not so long ago, we've been given something that was of a real concern for us. A few plumbers in the industry, one specific on a site who was performing some work, really put their employees at a very high risk. In fact, it was such a high risk that we decided to take this Toolbox talk and try and explain the reason why we were so concerned. And I'm sure you will see this as well. You'll understand the concerns on the safety aspect and why it is so important for us to actually bring this out to you as employers and employees. And specifically, we are speaking to you plumbers out there. We know a lot of safety professionals are also listening to this Toolbox talk, and we appreciate your backing. And what we just really want to emphasize is safety is done on site. It's not done behind a desk, writing in documents or filling in safety files. That is one aspect of it. But the majority of our time implementing safety and checking safety should really be done on site. So what does the law say about scope of authority, or ensuring employees understand what they are allowed to do or not allowed to do? Now, if we take a look at the right-hand side of the screen on the bottom, we are specifically looking at the OSH Act Section 8. Now, Section 8 of the OSH Act is the general duties of the employer, this is the owner of the company, to their employees. And so they've got a reasonable responsibility in terms of health and safety that they must implement to ensure the safety as well as the health of all their employees, as well as those who are not part of their employment. So any other person who may be affected by what they do. Now, here we have Section 8.2 and subsection J. It states that every employer has a responsibility to cause all his employees or her employees to be informed regarding the scope of their authority as contemplated in Section 37(1)(b). So I went ahead and I put Section 37(1)(b) up there for you. In fact, we've got the entire Section 37(1)(a) and (b) so that we can get what the law says in a flow. It's a little bit blacked out, as you can see there, because we want to focus really on Section 37(1)(b). But basically, Section 37.1 says whenever an employee, so we are specifically talking about employees, does something or omits to do any act which it would be an offense in terms of this act. In other words, you do something unsafe, or you do not do something that would be safe. So you act in an unsafe way, or you omit to do. So you don't do something that would be something that is required by law. Then you will notice it says in subsection B, it was not under any condition or in any circumstance within the scope of the authority of the employee to do or omit to do an act, whether lawful or unlawful, of the character of the act or omission charged. So what is this actually saying? Basically, the law requires an employer to explain to you as employees what you are legally allowed to do and what you should not be doing in terms of health and safety. And this is all brought out in your policies, your procedures, your safe working procedures, as well as the risk assessment, which makes up really the foundation of our health and safety management. So the risk assessment is going to explain to us that you are performing a certain task, and within this task, you have specific things that you should be doing. This is what we call a safe working procedure. And this safe working procedure often tells us that what we are supposed to be doing is protecting us by means of ensuring we do it in the correct methodology, the right way of doing something. And this is going to protect us because there's a procedure that is laid out in order to ensure each point of safety is checked or ensured while we are doing work. And something as simple as working at heights, setting up the ladder correctly, making sure the ladder's been inspected, making sure we've got a competent person who has checked the ladders beforehand, and then ensuring all employees are competent in working either on the ladder or working at heights if they are working on an elevated working platform. But now you see that there's a few extra things that go along with this. In other words, if you are told that you need to sign off boilers or installation of geysers, but you are not qualified to do that, are you allowed to do it? Just because the employer tells you this is your scope of authority, you are allowed to sign off boilers. Well, you would have to say, well, I'm not qualified to do that. Perhaps you have to have a specific qualification. Perhaps you have to be a master plumber. Perhaps you have to go and do a course on auditing. And you can see that this is very similar to being in the safety industry. If you have to work at heights on a roof, well, you need to be qualified. And nobody else can teach you that unless it's an accredited training course to say that we will then teach you how to work on a roof safely. And over and above that, you also need to have the resources to work on that roof safely. And this would include wearing a harness, having lifelines set up, or perhaps having fall prevention set up, which may require the use of a specialist contractor to come out and build these things, such as scaffolding, to ensure that you are protected within a cage. And this means that although you are told to do something, you need to ensure that you have the authority to do it. And this does not necessarily mean that the employer says you may do it and you work without the authority in terms of competency. So can you perform life-saving first aid if you have not been trained as a first aider? Well, no, that is outside of your authority, outside of your scope of authority, which means if you are appointed as a first aider, you must be trained as a first aider. So let us take a look at what happened just recently at one of the sites we visited. And unfortunately, this is a well-known plumber out in the area of auditing that we go and do for health and safety. Here we have them digging trenches and excavation to put in piping. If you take a look at the picture on the right-hand side, and we don't really have to ask you for any of your answers, I'm sure you can answer it yourself. Does it look like this is being performed in a safe manner? Yeah, we've got an employee whose scope of authority is plumbing. He's going to ensure that the excavation is either deep enough, level enough, compacted enough to ensure that when they lay down the piping, there's the correct materials underneath this piping in order to ensure that the piping remains stable, that it doesn't break or crack, doesn't bend, and it relatively remains pretty level in order to ensure the right gradient. So there's so many other things that go along with it that he's actually thinking of. But what about the safety aspect? You see, his scope of authority is plumbing, but are we confusing what we are doing with what is expected of us in terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So here's the scenario. You're working in a plumbing company and have just landed a big job. You're appointed as the plumber for the site, but realize you need to dig a trench or excavation deeper than 1.5 meters. And you will need to have a competent excavation supervisor for the site. Since you are the supervisor, you are appointed in the file, but have not undergone any training and have no experience specifically in terms of excavation. But you notice that in the safety file, you have been appointed as the excavation supervisor. And this is because you need to put the piping in. And so you need to know what goes in the excavation. And as a plumber, you do. But do you know the safety aspects around the actual excavation? Do you know what needs to be in place in terms of shoring, bracing, adequate access, and all the safety measures before we even go into the actual excavation to perform the plumbing? Now, what we are saying here is you would then be working outside of your scope of authority. Because yes, and we can fully agree with you, you know the plumbing side of this job. You know the plumbing side of this specific task for this client. But have you been trained and are you competent in the occupational health and safety of those employees' lives that are potentially at danger inside the excavation? Not just with the laying of the piping for the plumbing work, but the actual working in an excavation side of it. So the excavation collapses, it kills 2 other employees who were inside digging the excavation. Now we ask, who is liable? Well, instantly you're going to say, well, the employer, the owner of the company is liable. He put us in danger. Let us just go back then to what we are talking about from the law. The law states that an employer is required to cause all employees to be informed regarding the scope of their authority as contemplated in section 37(1)(b). In other words, you are told that you have to perform this installation. Have you taken into consideration the safety aspect in terms of your risk assessment and legislation, what is required by law in order to ensure that that job or task is done safely? Notice what section 37(1) starts with. The first 3 words, whenever an employee. Yes, we are talking about employees, not employers. And so, yes, ultimately, the employer is always liable. But as an employee, if you are not made conversant or you yourself do not accept that you may do or perhaps omit to do something that is in the interest of health and safety, you may also be held liable, especially if you sign that you accept the conditions of your scope in terms of being an excavation supervisor. So what do we need to do? How do we go about ensuring that we remain safe? Should you be performing work that is not within your scope of authority? And we're not talking about plumbing. Yes, you are a trained, qualified plumber, but health and safety goes hand in hand with that job. And if this is within your scope of authority and something goes wrong, the question of competence as well as adherence to the law will be asked, and you will be called into question. Now, you never want to be found negligent or reckless in your work. And this, again, goes hand in hand with being found negligent or reckless in terms of health and safety. Nor do we want to pay the price for incidents if they were out of our control. Now, when we're talking about paying the price, this is putting people's lives at risk, putting live people inside trenches and excavations that are not performed safely. So yes, you know your scope of work or scope of authority in terms of the plumbing aspect, but let us help each other, work together. So yes, we're talking about something negative. It's something that we do not want to see. It is something that is a non-conformance in the industry, but we want to look at the positive aspect. And the positive aspect is there is a solution. There is something that we can do, something active that we can promote. So speaking to all of you employers out there, you must ensure that you plan for the tasks and projects that you're going to be quoting for. This means you need to allocate sufficient resources to the project at hand, including mandatory training, medicals, specialized services, etc. So you know, in terms of the plumbing, what will be required for that site, whether trenches, working at heights, scaffolding, cherry pickers are going to be needed for that specific job. Plan for it. Make sure that you know what the health and safety aspects are to it. And then employees, don't just sign appointments. Make sure that you have the necessary training and competency to see it through. What is competency? Well, it is the necessary training, certification, as well as experience within that specific task. Now, who would want a plumber who has got 1 day experience of plumbing? They've never been taught, they've never gone to a plumbing school. They have a toolbox, they have a bucket, they have all the necessary resources, but they have no training except for 1 day on the job. Are you happy to have that person working alone, doing all of your plumbing? Well, not necessarily. The person might be very capable, but they do need to know and understand the SANS codes, the correct installation procedures. They perhaps need to know even the manufacturer's requirements for installing certain types of plumbing. So we are not saying that the person themselves is the incorrect person to do the job. What we're saying is that person perhaps needs a little bit more time, a little bit more assistance, more training and certification in order to undertake that specific project. This is exactly the same in terms of health and safety. Before we do anything, walk onto any site or perform any task, we need to ask ourselves, what is the health and safety aspect of performing this task? And do we have the competency in order to qualify to do that specific task? So what is the consequences of all of this? Now, we want to end off on a positive note, obviously, but we want to show the dire consequences of what actually happens to a person who performs any task or any scope outside of their scope of authority by recklessly or negligently just doing work that they are not actually competent to do. And as you can see here, any person, and we're talking about any person, employee, employer, doesn't matter. It speaks about any person who's performing this willfully or recklessly, does anything in the workplace in connection with the use of plant or machinery, which threatens the health and safety of any person. You see, it has to threaten the health and safety. It doesn't have to kill that person. If you are threatening the health and safety of a person, you will be guilty of an offense and could be liable to a fine not exceeding 50,000 Rand or imprisonment of 1 year or both the fine and imprisonment. And this could be you as the excavation supervisor, because you are working outside of your scope of authority. Now, over and above that, they will always take a look at the employer as well. And so the employer will be called into question because they have to ensure that they know and understand the legal safety aspect of performing that task. And if they do or omit to do anything which causes any person to be injured in a workplace, or again, causes a person to be injured to the point of even dying, well, you have 100,000 Rand fine, as well as imprisonment not exceeding 2 years or both. And this is the minimum. Remember, you will then go to court and you could be found liable even for manslaughter of that person or culpable homicide for that person. And then the fine, or well as the penalty of imprisonment, could be extended on top of this should the court find a ruling that you are guilty of this offense. So a minimum fine for any employee who works out of their scope could be 50,000 Rand, as well as 1 year in prison, or an employer who also omits to do or does something causing a person to be injured can also be liable for 100,000 Rand fine or an imprisonment period of 2 years. Again, this is the minimum. You could be found even more liable or you could be found guilty, and the court may rule on an even more severe punishment of yourself or another person who was involved in this. So please, the reason for this is really we want to express our gratitude to every single one of you for taking safety seriously. You start with these toolbox talks, you go on your training. Many of you are asking for assistance in terms of the safety files that we provide for you, or the safety training that we provide. But please let us never find ourselves negligent in an act or an omission to do something in terms of the law. So again, as we mentioned, this is something that came up not so long ago. We really thought this was very serious. We do not want to put any of our plumbers at risk. We want to ensure a safe site. Now, if you have any questions, comments, complaints, please reach out to us, safety@iopsa.org, info@ohss.co.za, or you can send us a WhatsApp message on the number in the top right-hand corner, 071-875-2070. Obviously, we want to make sure that we try and stop this before it happens. And if we see it, we are not fighting with anyone. Please accept that we are doing this in the interest of health and safety. And so if we do speak to you personally, we're looking for a solution to the problem. We are not looking to blame anybody. So again, thank you very much for joining us for our Toolbox Talk this morning.